Welcome to this session on Comics of the New Europe, which is a collection of articles about comics from East Germany, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, former Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, and Ukraine. It is much easier, I think, to say New Europe. As I said, we have both editors and one of the participants. Next up, we have Elizabeth Biz Najdan. Now, Biz and I don't go back quite as far as Jose and I do. We met at 450 today, but already I feel like I know her. I'm already a big fan of her work from reading her contribution to this collection. Biz is an assistant professor in German studies in the Department of Central, Eastern, and Northern European Studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. She's also an SHRC postdoctoral fellow at the University of Waterloo, working on her book manuscript, Paneled Pasts, History, Media, and Memory in the German Graphic Novel, which is under contract with Ohio State University Press. Biz's research and teaching interests include the representation of history in comics, comics and new media on migration, and comics as a feminist methodology. She also sits on the executive committee of the International Comics Arts Forum and the executive board for the Comic Studies Society. So Biz, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to Jose and Marta for inviting me to participate. I'm one of the contributors of this volume, so I'm sandwiched between the editors, and my presentation will be a little bit different because I didn't envision the book as such. So I'm going to frame and present an excerpt from the chapter that I contributed to this volume, and then connect a little bit to the larger book project from which it came from. So I'm just gonna share my screen. Can everyone see my title slide? Let's see some thumbs up. Excellent. I'm shifting into teaching very quickly, so you can already hear it. Thumbs up, everyone. Okay. The year 2009, which marked the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, saw the publication of 3 graphic novels narrating individual histories of the German Democratic Republic. Simon Schwarz's Drüben, or The Other Side of the Wall, recounts his parents' decision to leave East Germany in the 1980s. Claire Lenkova's Grenzgebiete, or Border Zone, is a children's comic book that helps young readers understand the divided nation that defined their parents' generation. Lastly, Flix's Da war mal was, There Was Once Something There, is a collection of humorous anecdotes from both sides of the wall. Directed at young adults who witnessed the collapse of the GDR but were too young to understand the complexity of their country's separation, these 3 publications visualized the experience of living in East Germany through the children that resided there. They presented the state's oppressive politics and contradictions through anecdotes about growing up in East Germany, while also relating historically accurate facts about life in the GDR through footnotes. Drüben, Grenzgebiete, and Da war mal was launched a movement that has since evolved into a new genre of the German graphic novel. As more comics thematizing East Germany began to appear, what started as a commemoration of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 2009 quickly turned into a trend in the representation of East German experience. Today, there are over 20 graphic novels that retell the history of the GDR, with more coming out every year. Within this emergent genre of autobiographical, fictional, and non-fictional graphic narratives on East German history, my chapter identifies a subgroup, which I have termed graphic historiography. Decidedly a niche phenomenon, this category consists of some half-dozen comic works that bear striking similarities, namely the extensive use of archival images, documents, and sources. Furthermore, I would argue that this body of graphic literature comments on the very process of historical writing, hence its categorization as historiography, which is both the study of historical writing as well as the processes of it. Typically not produced by East Germans, but about East Germans, these texts differ in tone, strategies, goals, and strategies from the autobiographical and semi-autobiographical graphic novels by the 3rd generation of East Germans who authored these texts. They feature graphic narratives that describe important events in East German history, such as the fall of the Berlin Wall, the People's Uprising of 1953, in addition to well-documented aspects of living in the GDR, such as the strict censorship, political oppression, and attempts to flee. Moreover, these graphic novels are heavily researched, with traces of that process clearly signaled within the texts themselves. They were all, in fact, produced in collaboration with experts in East German history and with the support of German pedagogical, political, or historical foundations. Graphic historiography thereby emerges not just as artistic creations by individuals or groups of individuals, but also as part of various institutional projects that seek to commemorate and communicate the history of East Germany to a wider public. And as you'll know, as readers potentially of the volume in which this is published, you'll know this isn't a trend that's only found in post-Soviet Germany. It's something that's happening in wider post-Soviet Europe. In turn, the programmatic nature of these endeavors incorporates the graphic novels themselves into the archive from which they emerge as part of the institution's collections. Of the examples of graphic historiography I've encountered, Berlin geteilte Stadt, or Berlin, a city divided, makes the most concerted effort to mobilize the archive. In addition to heavily researched contextual information at the end of each chapter that articulates the historical and political situation in which the biographical episode takes place, Susanne Budenberg and Thomas Hensler reproduced archival documents within the chapters, within the individual chapters, and detailed renderings of archival artifacts in the introduction to each chapter. They also engage photography for plot points and reference material. Using Berlin Divided City as a case study, my chapter in Comics of the New Europe assesses the role of the archive in aesthetic and narrative strategies in representing history, demonstrating how its deployment in graphic narrative gestures towards the veracity of comics historical presentation, while undermining the idea of authentic representations of history altogether. I thereby argue that subjective interpretations of historical events in the comics form, even when fictionalized, are an important avenue for imparting historical experience. With particular interest in the graphic narrative's use of archival photographs, which emerge at the discursive intersection of comic scholarship on authenticity and the myth of photographic truth, I posit that the hand rendering of archival documents simultaneously draws attention to the constructed nature of comics and the obscuring quality of photographic mediation. Drawn photography and comics on historical subjects thereby function as symbols for the artifice of historical writing, demonstrating that history itself is also a construction which relies heavily on narrative structures, temporal signifiers legible to contemporary readers, mediation, and memory. This work actually, and to frame the work that was published in this particular chapter, comes out of the ongoing research for my book project, in which I examine this category of graphic narrative on East German history more broadly. So instead of how you typically see research on the relationship between history and comics, in which there's a comic that we then examine how it presents history, I've kind of flipped this on its head by looking at an entire category of history and then looking at all of the comics that emerge, thematizing that period of history. Beyond looking at markers of historical authenticity in these comics, this larger project investigates how comics on East German experience that focus on objects of historical significance can be set in dialogue with museum practice. In addition to a close examination of the archival objects, such as those found in Berlin, a city divided, this project also examines the role of the most visible objects of East German everyday culture, which were collected in German museums after 1989 and have since appeared in comics and graphic novels in East German experience. I posit that their appearance in graphic narrative maps on to social justice-oriented exhibition practices that attempt to build community and acknowledge lived experience through material culture. Moreover, I demonstrate how this body of graphic literature engages with discourses around East German memory culture and consumer products to intervene in debates on the fetishization of East Germany's everyday artifacts. In this context, I situate the materiality of East German memory culture in terms of the Ostalgie phenomenon, which is a combination of the word Ost, meaning East, and Nostalgie, which means nostalgia, before I turn to the presentation of these same objects in United Germany's cultural institutions and comics and graphic novels. Looking particularly at material culture objects in Berlin, a city divided, and Marvel's Kinderland, Childhood in East Berlin, which was recently translated into English, as well as other graphic novels such as Drüben, Das Upgrade, and Berliner Mythen by Reinhard Kleist. This project interrogates the mobilization of consumer products.
I couldn't hear what you said.
Of the East German everyday culture, alongside archival documents and museum artifacts in the service of historical understanding, by setting their appearance in comics in explicit dialogue with conventions and exhibiting East German material culture and history in museums. By looking at these as comics as a kind of curated museum experience in their own right, in the sense that they place objects on display in an effort to communicate something about history, this project ultimately advocates for the position of comics in discourses on East German memory culture, as well as for comics in conversations on historical representation more broadly. And to return to that slide that I just showed you to give you an example of some of this work that the other parts of my book project is doing, you can see examples of the same objects in East German museums of material culture, which are relatively popular throughout all of United Germany, as well as in one particular comic book, Marvel's Kinderland, which opens with a series of silent panels looking at objects of East German historical experience. So yeah, I look forward to your comments and questions, but in the meantime, we can move on to the other editor of this fantastic volume.
Great. Thank you. Okay, you could share your screen, please?
Yeah.
Okay.